Hello there, friends. I hope that you are doing well, and I hope that you're looking forward to diving into this image and to learn some tips and techniques onto how to add some realistic elements to your composites. So in this sort of walkthrough tutorial, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks on how to make sure that your composited images all blend together nicely, especially when you have an artificial light source or a manufactured light source, like in this image of me riding this giant snail, or maybe it's a regular sized snail and I'm just tiny. It was inspired by my obsession with the snails in my garden. I tormented some snails, these poor little guys, in my garden. You can see there's quite a few photos of them, and I really wanted to create an image that kind of told the story of what they get up to at night, and so that's where this idea came from. That there must be sort of a night watch of the garden, and so this is the snail that kind of makes sure everything is going well in the garden at night. And so I wanted to kind of create this image, and I'm going to walk you through how we created it, or how I created it. So here's sort of the elements of the image. There's obviously a little bit more in terms of the vines and in terms of extra little bits that I've added to add some whimsy, but we'll get into that. Ideally, we just have a few main core elements. We have the background, and so this background is actually one that I created last year for another image, and I really enjoy building backgrounds and sort of layering up backgrounds. So this background was built up out of a lot of different layers. So it's layers of trees, layers of the foliage and the leaves. And what I do when I create these backgrounds is I build it up so that they are framing the center of the image. So you can swap out that back part of the image, and you could put in clouds, you could put in mountains, you could put in other features. But I think that it's a fun way to build up your own sort of stories. And I'm going to include this background or this template or kind of this resource for you in the files. So if you want to play around with it and see what you can create, then you're welcome to do that. So that's the kind of basic part of our image. And then we have also the other elements. We have the stone bridge. So this was a stock image that I found on Unsplash because I searched and searched and searched in my own files, and I could not find a picture of a stone bridge. And so I had to rely on unsplash.com for a stone bridge, but that's totally fine. And then we have obviously our snail friend, our little snail. Then we have a picture of me, just shot in an overcast sky. This was yesterday. It was about to storm. It was actually thundering at the time. So it's nice and overcast. There's no harsh light. There's nothing. So I know I can add in the light when I need to. And then we have a couple extra elements that I've downloaded from Pixel Squid, which is our little lamp here. You could also use a picture of your own lamp or a light bulb or a candle or whatever you have around you, and then our little mushrooms. So I don't have any of these really cool looking mushrooms around, so I couldn't shoot any. So I used those mushrooms from Pixel Squid. So that's sort of the base elements of our photo. So let's work on how we can bring them all in together. So I have sort of the bare bones of the image. So everything's been put into place. So we have that framing of the background, and you can see what I mean by adding in those different elements. So all of these elements in the background are just layered on top of each other. And I find that really helps to add a level of depth. So when you have elements that are more blurred and elements that are closer to the frame, it really does help you to build this idea that there's more depth going on in the photo. So you can see all these elements. We can move them around if we need to. We can make them bigger if we need to. But it's really an opportunity for you to build kind of depth and interest into your image by having those blurred out points at the edge and really building out kind of a lot of layers of depth rather than having everything on the same focal plane. Now, as I said, on the background, we have our back plate there. So you can see that these three images make up sort of the back of the image. We have just like a kind of basic forest scene. Then we have a little bit thicker of some rainforest, and then we just have some like really soft clouds, and the soft clouds one is blurred to oblivion and then lower opacity, and that just helps to kind of tie it all in together. It kind of just neutralizes kind of some of the background, but they all work together in a really cohesive way. So if we didn't have all of those elements, it would look kind of funny, but once we build them all together, it looks really nice. And like I said, you could always put in another photo. So you could use clouds if you wanted to use clouds. You could have a mountain scene. You could use a cityscape. You could use houses, whatever you want to have. That's the great thing about building out these backgrounds, is that they're highly customizable. So in the tutorial I posted recently, building out that moss brush, we have these kind of moss overhangs there. And I also put in quite a lot of detail in the moss. So we have some moss and vines on the snail itself. So if we zoom in, you can see that there's some moss growing on our little snail friend and on the lamp here. And we have the moss sort of creating these vines hanging down. So that just helps to add a little more interest when you can add in those elements like overgrowth or moss or different textures. That is another way that you can really add some detail, add some realism to your composites, is thinking about all those little details where maybe not everyone is going to even notice that you've put that in there, but it's worth spending a bit of time to add in a little bit more detail. So adding in things like those little bits of moss and those little bits of, overhanging greenery and shrubbery, or whatever you want to call them, that is one way that you can definitely help to make things look a little bit more interesting. So it's just finding places that you can add a little bit more detail. I like to think of it sometimes as like, when I was a kid, I really liked those I Spy books, or like things like, see if you can find the butterfly in this book, or see if you can find the bird in this book. And so I really liked those, and so I think that's what I tried to do in my own images, is like try to sneak in some things that maybe if someone was looking, they would find these little bits of overhang, or maybe I can hide a bird in there somewhere, or a butterfly, or a little ladybug or something in there. So it's one way that you can really create more interest, is by just adding in those little subtle details that really tie it all in together. So obviously we've already masked away the background around the portrait, but what really helps to set this all up together, if we go back to the finished image, you can see that it's really dynamic. The light is really bright, and that really casts a strong light on the snail, on the shell, on me, on the background, on the mushrooms, and we need to really work on creating that dynamic light, because as you can see right now, it's rather flat. So the first thing I like to do is I like to work on the light itself. So we have our photo of our, steampunk kind of lamp here. And what we're going to do is we're going to work on making that look as realistic as possible. So we have our light here. What we're going to do is we're going to start painting in our light. So we have our light layer, and we're just going to add a new layer on top of that, and we're going to clip it together. So we're just going to hold Alt, and we're going to hover in between those, and it's going to have a box with an arrow pointing down, and that is now clipped. So anything that we paint now using our brush or using anything is going to only impact that light layer, which is exactly what we want. And I'll show you what I mean by that. You can see that only the light is being impacted by that. Now that was pretty extreme, but that's pretty much the idea of what we're going to do. Before we start to paint our light on there, what we're going to do is we're actually going to double click. We're going to name this glow first, and then we're going to double click on that layer, and it's going to open up our layer style window. Now over here in the center of our options, it's going to say transparency shapes layer. We're going to unclick that, and that's going to help us to create a glowing effect that has a little bit less kind of harsh lines. So it helps to kind of blend it all together. It helps to impact the layer in a different way when we click that option. So what we're going to do is we are going to pick a nice soft, warm, glowing color of yellow. So this is pretty close, but I'm going to make it a little bit less yellow, maybe a little bit more warm. So maybe a little bit more orange. I just have to undo all the stuff that I just did. There we go. So I'm just going to pick a little bit more of a warmer color there, somewhere like that is good. And then I'm just going to make sure that my brush is nice and soft, and I'm going to lower the opacity of that 33%, and then I'm going to switch the blending mode to, whoopsie, I didn't actually put the glow on there. I went too far in my undoing that I actually undid adding the new layer. There we go. Glow. So we're going to go back and click on that transparency shapes layer, switch our blending mode to screen. We have our nice soft brush. We're just going to paint in a first round of our glow, and what we're going to do is we're going to try and just make it look as realistic as possible when we paint this in. So it might take a few swipes to build up this idea of the light, but that's really what we want. We don't want it to be super harsh. We want to build it up nice and slowly. So when we start to paint that in, it's going to build up nice and slow, and that's what we really want to do. So we're going to focus kind of on the center and just build it out, and you can see that it's helping to cast a bit more realistic light. So we zoom out, we're starting to get much closer to where we want to be. We're going to add another layer on top of our light, and we're going to make that color a little bit more bright and a little bit more yellow. And we're not going to put it onto a different blending mode just yet. We're going to increase the opacity to about 60%. And we are going to double click on that again. Click on transparency shapes layer again. And this just helps to give it some better control when we add that light color onto there. So we have kind of the bare bones of our light, but we're going to keep working at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a new layer on top of those painted glow layers. So it's not clipped to anything, it's all by itself. What we're going to do is we're going to have that on screen mode, and then we're going to just simply paint in our glow. So it's going to kind of take over the light bulb, but we're just going to start in the center and sort of build it out. And it might be a bit too harsh, so we can lower our opacity to like 20%. We're just going to start in the center and like build it out a bit. You can see that when we zoom out, that's really helping to tie that all in together. You may need to lower the opacity of your layer if you need to as well, but that's essentially the start of what we're going to do. We're going to add a new layer on top of that, and we're going to go an even lighter, almost kind of really pale yellow, and we're going to go right just into the center of our light bulb here and just paint in that light bulb there. And then we're going to flip that to screen as well. So we're creating a really bright glow in the very center of our light bulb because that's where the core of our light is going to be, and then we're going to branch it outwards. So the wider you go, the lower your opacity of your brush should be. So you don't want it to be super harsh when you're painting that outward glow. When you're painting that outward glow, you want it to be nice and the soft opacity of your brush. So we can just add in that nice glow, and you can see that that's really helped to tie everything in together. Now obviously the moss and the light, this layer here, we need to move that underneath. So we're just going to move that so that that glow is hitting the moss as well. That looks good. So we have our light source now. So we have that really strong glowing light, and we need to start thinking about how it's going to be impacting the different elements of our image. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's start with the snail. So we have our snail here, and our snail has pretty even light. It doesn't have a lot of shadows to it yet. It doesn't have a lot of light to it yet, but we're going to get there. We're going to add that in. And how we're going to do that is with some adjustment layers. So we're going to start with a curves layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to make that curves layer super dark. So we're actually going to take the corner, the top corner, we're going to drag it down. And you're going to see that it's going to turn our snail, our whole image pretty dark. But what we're going to do is we're going to clip that to just our snail. So down here, you see this box with an arrow pointing down. We're going to click on that. And now it's going to clip that dark kind of curves layer just to our snail. What we're going to do next is we are going to invert that. So we're just going to hold Control or Command I and flip that mask so that instead of it being a white mask, now it's black. So that turned it totally black. We're going to take our regular soft round brush. We're going to make sure that our brush is on white and that our opacity is about 60%. And we're just going to start painting in where we think the darkest shadows would be. Now, obviously, if our light source is here, we are going to be putting in our shadows away from the light. So this whole end of our snail is going to be pretty dark in the shadows there because it's the furthest point away from the light. And you can see right away that it's starting to paint in that nice darker shadow. It's really starting to have an effect pretty much at the beginning. If you need to build up that shadow even more, you can always open up your curves layer that we created and you can make that curve even darker, even deeper, and that's going to have an impact you can see right away. So we're just going to keep painting in on that mask any parts of the shadow that we think are going to be there. So where those vines are, we're going to paint in those shadows. We're going to work on adding shadows onto those vines later. Kind of right on those edges, right near the bottom of our snail where it's touching the bridge, we're going to add some shadows as well. And you can see pretty much immediately that that really helps to build up that idea of realism. So just by making that end of the snail that's furthest away from the light darker, it's really having that effect. Now we're going to add in a bit of shadow underneath me as well. So underneath the portrait, thinking about where their shadows would be lying. So we know that the light source is here. It's going to be hitting the figure here. So there's obviously going to be some shadows where I'm sitting and then also being cast by the blocking of that light. So again, we're going to work on adding the shadows to the vines, but that's going to be a pretty good start. Now we're going to do the same thing, but in reverse for adding in some glow onto our snail. So we're going to go back to our snail layer. We're going to add in a curves layer. We're going to make it a little bit brighter this time. So we're not going to drag it down. We're going to drag that point upwards. So you have that kind of really arcing line there. And then what we're actually going to do is we're going to take our red channel here, our red curve, and we're going to boost that one up a little bit as well. Not too much, just a little bit. You can see that it has that immediate reaction. And we're going to take our blue channel and we're going to drag that one down a little bit. And that's going to add a little bit more yellow into our curve. So you can see that it made it into that kind of warm yellow. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to invert that. So Control Command I, so that our mask is now black. And we're going to do what we just did with our shadows, but this time with our highlights, we're going to paint that in. So we know that where the light's going to be the strongest is likely right around the light there. So on the shell there. And then also on the top of our little snail friend's head and his little, I don't know if these are eyes or antennas or whatever they are, but those long things on our snail. And you can see that we're building up that light as well. Again, if you need to make that light even brighter, even stronger, we can just double click on our curves layer and we can work on bringing in a bit more light into our nice glow there. You can see that right away, just doing those two curves layers really help to add some realism to our snail. So that's without any adjustments, without any curves, and now we have some shadows and some highlights and that warm glow happening on our snail, and that's really helping to build it all together. Sometimes you have to go back and forth. When you are creating your shadows and highlights, you might see, oh, I need to add in some shadows underneath here, and I might need to work on some shadows underneath there, and maybe I need to work on some shadows in the shell. Maybe I need to work on adding in some more highlights, closer to the top here. And that's fine. You're just building it up nice and slowly. So you can go back and forth as much as you need to build in those realistic looking effects. It does take a little bit of time. We're going to do that same technique when we look at adding in the light to the portrait as well. So when we go up to our portrait layer, which is right here, I'm just going to label that. We're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to use a curves layer. We're going to clip it using the square with the arrow pointing down. And we're going to add in some shadows. So we're going to drag this curves layer down. You're going to see that it's going to turn that whole portrait a lot darker. We're going to want to drag that so that it's a nice deep shadow. This is something that you might have to do, gradually just to see what works best for your own image. We're going to invert that, and then we're going to do what we've been doing. We're just going to paint in that shadow. So we're just going to think, where's that shadow going to be? It's going to be where the light is furthest away. So along the back there, back of the arms, underneath the arm there, underneath the leg there, underneath the boots there. Really just thinking about where those shadows would be deepest. And we're using a lower opacity brush, so about 40%, because we want to do this gradually. We don't want to do it too quick. And we're going to do the same thing, adding in our curves for the highlight. So you just want to always make sure that it has the arrow pointing down. So when you are adding in your curves to add shadows or highlights, just make sure that it is clipped. So again, we're going to this time drag that up. So we're going to have that nice highlight going on. We're going to want to add a little bit more yellow into that. And maybe a little bit more red as well, just like we did with the snail. That's looking good, and we're going to invert that, and we're going to paint this one in as well. So again, thinking, where's that light hitting the harshest? It's right there on the leg. It's right there on the leg. It's right there on the hand, the chest, the face. Now, we might need to do this twice because we really want that light to be nice and strong. So you can see that it's added quite a lot of that nice color, that nice sort of warmth to it, but it doesn't feel quite as strong as we need it to be. So we're going to go in, and this time we're going to add a levels layer. It's clipped as well because we've gone to our portrait and we've made sure that it's clipped. And we're going to do the same sort of thing. We're just going to add in some stronger levels or stronger contrast of that light. So you can play with your sliders here to see which levels and which percentages are going to work best for you. But I want there to be a little bit more contrast, a little bit more, I wouldn't say overblown light, but I want it to be a little bit more intense, those highlight bits. So that's looking better to me. And then I'm going to invert that. And just like we've been doing with our curves, I'm going to paint that back in. So where I want it to be even brighter on the hand there and on the leg there, we're just painting in that extra kind of bright levels layer. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the blending mode of that to color, or to screen actually, and I'm going to lower the opacity of that. So it's just going to help to add in just a bit more of an intense kind of light to it. So you can see turning it off, turning it on, it's just going to help bring in a bit of that light. So you can see that our light is definitely coming together. We're getting the shadows, and we're just going to do the same thing there with our mushrooms as well. So we have our mushrooms here, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to group those together. And we're going to add in some shadows and some highlights the exact same way. So we're just going to go in. Oops, that was the wrong one. You can add in adjustment layers onto groups, which is really helpful. So we're going to add in curves, and we can clip that to our whole group of mushrooms. So when we look at our mushrooms there, we're going to add in some shadows. We're going to drag that one down. It's going to make our mushrooms really dark. And then we're going to paint in those shadows, thinking about, okay, where are those shadows going to be? The shadows are going to be on the right hand side, so furthest away from the light source, near the bottom, and kind of the ones that are maybe behind are going to have darker, deeper shadows. And you can see that because those mushrooms, the colors of those mushrooms were already pretty light, that we probably don't even really need to work on adding highlights to them, because they kind of had the right color tones and the right lighting as the rest of the image. So we can add in our contrast to our vines, as we mentioned. So we're going to do the same thing. It's really just adding lots of curves layers, clipping them to all the different elements, and just painting everything in is going to help make it look nice and realistic. So we're going to darken those vines there. That looks pretty good, maybe a bit darker. Yep. And we're going to invert that, and we're just going to paint in our vine shadows. Any minute now. There we go. And we're just going to start from the right hand side, just painting in those shadows, just making sure that the shadows on the right are the darkest. And then of course we have some shadow work to make sure that we're getting, I'm really zoomed out, underneath there we want it to be, those vines to be darker, underneath the foot, underneath the leg there. Just working on darkening anything that might need to be just a little bit darker. So you can see that really helps that look more realistic as well. So in just using the curves layers, clipping them and then painting back in the highlights and shadows, we've really started to work on the overall effect. So adding in that light, and that's a huge part of this image, is adding in that realistic light. But there's a few other things that we can do to really help tie this all in together. And a lot of that is going to be in more adjustment layers. So I just need to rotate my image. Sometimes when I use my touch screen, I end up moving the image around. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up and start to work on some different color adjustments. So the first one we can work on is curves. So I'm going to show you how we're going to use curves to help tie this in. So when we turn that one off, what we can do is we can start to use just a general curves layer. So we have our curves here, and we want it to be a bit deeper, because when we use a deeper curves layer, you can see that it really helps make that contrast of that light stand out. I'm going to go into the green level here, or the green curve, and I'm actually going to drag that down a little bit, and that's going to help add in a little bit of blue. And then I'm going to grab the red curves channel, I'm going to add in a little bit of red and just drag that bottom one up a little bit. So that's just going to add a little bit of purple tone, add a little bit of depth into that image, help to tie it in all together. So it's kind of adding in a little bit more of a whimsical tone, but you can see that adding that curves layer, making it more contrasted and dark, is helping actually to make the light look a lot more natural, a lot more realistic. That's just with one curves layer. Next, we're going to add in another curves layer, and this one is going to be sort of a vignette. So we're just going to drag that down so it's a little bit darker than we might want it to be, but then we're going to invert it like we have been doing. And this time we're just going to paint it in on the corners. So we're going to have our brush nice and low at about 40%, and we're just going to start to paint in kind of around the edges, nice and slow. And it's just going to sort of darken the corners, darken the edges, which is going to help draw our eye into the center. So this is going to take a few seconds because my computer is slow today. There we go. So you can see that that was subtle, but it does help to really draw the eye in. You can see that that is helping to really draw the eye into the image. And the last one that we're going to use is a color lookup table. So we're going to go into our color lookup table. So it's in adjustments there. You can always go down and then click on our color lookup, which is halfway through. And then we're going to go into our moonlight or night from day, whichever one that you prefer, and it's going to turn it really dark like that. And then we're going to do what we've just done, but kind of in reverse. So we're not going to invert that mask. We're going to leave it, but we're going to have our brush on black and we're going to paint that back in. So increase the opacity to 60%, and we're just going to paint back that mask. So it's just going to keep the corners of that nice and dark, but it's a nice and kind of that moody blue color, but we're just bringing it in back to where we had it originally. So that color lookup table is really helping to blend the color tones, make it a bit more dark and kind of nighttime-esque, but it's helping to tie it all in together. Now, you can add in other elements to really boost the realism or boost the kind of whimsy in your composite images like these. So I added in some of these like bokeh lights. So it's just some pictures of Christmas lights that I added onto screen mode and then just blurred them a little bit. That helps to add a little bit more interest or intrigue. Maybe they're glow bugs, maybe they're fairy lights, maybe they're, you know, magical fairy dust, whatever you want to call it. And we can also go in and we can add in some little light specks on our lamp. So let's talk about that, how we can add in some light specks. So we're just going to add a new layer. We're going to go into our brush. We're going to select our hard round brush, this one right here. I'm going to just lower the opacity of that so it's probably, I would say 25-ish, just so it's a nice size, about like that. We're going to open up our brush preset menu, our brush settings panel. We're going to hit shape dynamics, hit the size jitter, increase that pretty high, about 100%, 80 to 100%. Go to our brush tip shape, increase the spacing of that. Go to our scattering, we're going to scatter the heck out of that. Then we're going to go down to transfer, and where it says pen pressure, we're going to make sure that that's clicked, so it's just in this menu, pen pressure. Opacity jitter, we're going to drag that all the way up. Flow jitter, we're going to drag that about 50%. And now what that's going to do is it's going to help give us these little kind of glowing little dust specks. So when we start to paint, you'll see that we have these nice little glowing dust specks. So that was just a quick little brush that we created, a little glow speck brush, whatever you want to call it, dust, I don't know. And you can tell that that really helps to tie that in, makes it look a little bit more realistic. When we see kind of glowing light, there's always that kind of dust or magic or whatever you want to call it that's there. So that's what we're doing, is we're just using that nice warm color. It's on screen blending mode. We're just painting that those nice dust specks in. And that's just a small detail, like I said, that helps to tie it all in together. So when we go in and look at it, we have those really nice dust specks. So if you have an artificial light source, just creating that brush really quickly using the hard round brush and just playing with the brush settings panel can be one way that you can add in just a little bit more interest. You could also use that same brush to kind of create those glowing bits, so you can use that to kind of paint in those bokeh bits around the outside. Just one simple brush can really help to elevate that. So I think that that's pretty close to being how I created this image. I kind of even like this edit a little bit more than the finished edit, but it's just using curves layers really and just painting back in nice and slow the highlights. So you had that sort of bare bones image before we had all of our adjustments. We can see that when we turn off all of those adjustments, all of those curves layers, that really it was the curves layers that helped bring that light together. We painted on our light source using just our regular brush, and it was just a few of those glow layers on screen, and just, you know, painting in just with a regular brush all those different levels of light. And then we used our curves layers to really build up the shadows on all the elements. So onto the shell, onto the moss and the vines, onto the portrait, just using those curves layers to paint that in nice and gradually. And it really does help to make it look really believable and helps you to control where the light is hitting. And I think that that's a really easy way that you can use a brush and curves to help make your artificial light source look more realistic. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about how I created this image and some tips and tricks on how you can create more realistic composites. Just looking for opportunities to add in subtle details, using the brush tools to add in some sparkles or dust, and just painting in those highlights and shadows to make sure everything looks nice and blended. I hope that you enjoyed, and I can't wait to see what you create next. Thanks for watching.